or Norm Brown. I'm just going to hand over to him now to introduce himself.
Hello there, everybody. I'm Norm, and I'm a crime author with 3 published books just now and another couple to come out after Christmas.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your books?
Yeah, certainly, yeah. So the 3 books that are currently in print are based on a Californian detective called Leighton Jones, who's a reluctant investigator. So it's a guy who's a traffic cop who gets inadvertently pulled into 3 different serial killer murders. So he's fairly unlucky. And each of the 3 novels are loosely based on real cold case true crime events. And the strange thing or the unusual thing about the books is that they go backwards in time. So the first novel, called The Girl on the Bus, starts on the last week of the detective's time at work. So he's retiring, and then the previous novels jump back 10 years at a time. So the first one, Girls on the Bus, is set in the present day, and then we jump back 10 years and then 20 years. And the 4th novel I've just finished is 30 years back from then.
Wow. What made you choose to set them in America?
Right, sure. Yeah, it's a good question, especially UK Crime Book Club. That when I decided that I was going to have a serious stab at crime writing, that I was surrounded by very capable Scottish crime authors, and it seemed like even in my local bookstore that there was Val McDermid and Ian Rankin, but there was other ones. Bloody Scotland was in its infancy and kicking off, and Lynn Anderson was getting a lot of coverage as well. And so I felt like if I decided to introduce another Scottish detective into the field, that I'd be struggling, and also because I'd read a lot of them, I'd feel like I would be influenced or inadvertently or consciously by a lot of the texts that I'd read, and also was running out of locations as well. So what I decided I would do is I would copy the Bram Stoker model. I've never ever been to America, never been to California, I know nothing about Oceanside, so I had to dig deep. I had to order maps over the internet, so I bought maps of Southern California, practical physical maps, and use Google Earth and YouTube drive-throughs where people have just sat a camera on the dashboard and have just driven a huge stretch of highway. So I had to use all of these means to make myself familiar enough with a place that I could write about it in a practically convincing way. It doesn't always hit the mark, but I feel very much as if I know the areas that I've written about because I've dug so deep, even into the past, to the kind of historical basis for the city of Oceanside, where it's set. So yeah, Bram Stoker had never been to Transylvania and was able to depict it in an entertaining way. So that was it for me, and it really meant that I was able to spend a lot of cold, wet winters in Scotland, feeling like I was in Southern California without the jet lag. So that was the rationale behind setting them there.
So is Oceanside a real place, or a?
Yeah, Oceanside's a really picturesque. And when I thought that I would, that I would have a North American-based detective, I originally planned to set it in Oregon and based around a couple of podcasters who stumble onto a real crime. So I started writing a synopsis for this novel called Trapdoor, based around a fictional podcast site. But when I was researching just the area, I kept getting pings under Amazon to say, you also might be interested in, and one of the things that it suggested might be interested in was this Oceanside area, which is a really traditional, really beautiful, picturesque kind of Southern Californian city. It's where you film things like Top Gun was filmed there. The idea of huge tall palm trees and orange sunsets. It's really kind of classically American, but it meant that I could avoid comparisons with Harry Bosch, because I'd written about a character who's widowed and so has to raise his child alone, and so he's constantly feeling like he's a failure professionally and personally, but he's got this focus, so away from the murders. I quite like reading crime fiction where it doesn't sit at the same intensity or the same focus all the way through the plot. I like kind of texture, and so whenever you can bring your main character home or into a different setting, then I suppose it lets readers see a different kind of side to them. So having Oceanside as a real place meant that I had some kind of structure for his world, and I could find out where his daycare would be for dropping his kid, and I could work out the times and distances it would take people to travel to the police station and beyond. So yeah, very much a real place. Yeah.
So what kind of research did you need to do for the police procedures? He's quite an interesting policeman, because he's not a homicide detective, even though he sort of detects murders.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then that was really tricky as well, because again, that because the police procedural novels can be so detail heavy, and I really wanted to try and give a sense of Leighton's job without really going into the bureaucracy of it and the kind of administrative tasks that a lot of modern policing kind of involves. So yeah, I did research the policing structures to see what a job would entail, what traffic cars would be used, which guys would be the kind of CHIPS traditional highway patrol guys on motorcycles, and who would take the driver awareness classes, and what colour the road cones would be. But some of it's quite tricky as well, because things like the weapons that these police officers would carry would vary from state to state, and San Diego would have its own identifiable police cars, and so when you start looking into what do they call it? What's the call sign that's used for this kind of incident, or what kind of weapons would they carry? That it shifts around, So in a way, I would say that he put his hand on his revolver, but I would try and be non-specific for the stuff that changes across some of the boundaries. But the Oceanside Police Department were really, really helpful. They've got a really detailed website where they give you actually an archive history. Because I just got my head around the police station, and I kind of made notes on it, and I had some photographs when I'd first started, when I was using archive maps that I'd bought and had them spread out on the dining room table. And so I'd written, so I looked at the police station. I was like, yes, this is brilliant, and started getting descriptions of it, just making notes down for how I would describe this building. And it was an old kind of hacienda building. It had peach stone arches, and it looked like a holiday villa. So I've written all this kind of descriptive content for it. And then when I'd scrolled down through one of the pages on the official site, it said, of course, we moved from this location to our new location a few years later. And so I had to then go away and find out what the new station looked like. But it was quite good, because it meant I could have my character having flashbacks to earlier days in the old station, in some of them. But yeah, so I had to do the research for the uniform, what they would wear, but also whose toes that Leighton Jones would trample on were he to start sniffing around investigations that really were the jurisdiction of homicide. And I do get, I get positive feedback from readers in North America who have asked me how long I've spent in Oceanside, and if I'd studied in the area and stuff. So yeah, I'm a bit of a fraud, but yeah, it was entertaining.
So your research sounds really in depth. What kind of author are you? Do you plot it all out sort of really detailed in advance, or make it up as you go?
Yeah, not at all. The crazy thing is the way that I write everything. Like I say, there's another couple of novels sitting to the side, and there's other ones that are unpublished as well. And For about 20 years, what I've done is I've written the first chapter, usually a prologue and usually an epilogue, and then I've worked my way in from like either side. It's like, you know, in the Disney movie where the two dogs are eating spaghetti. It's kind of like that. I'm coming at it from both ends, and hopefully the plot meets up. I feel like I'm building a bridge across a canyon and hoping to make it to connect in the middle. But I really like writing an ending and working towards that ending. And yeah, there's a lot of shifting and backtracking and movement along that route. But yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. But what I tend to do is beforehand try and gather enough information on character and setting and whatnot, so that I'm feeling equipped, that I can just propel myself forward, that I can just go with the narrative, and without having to stop too much. I would really struggle if I was in the middle of writing something and I had to stop and jump onto Wikipedia or Google Maps to go and find out stuff. So a lot of the time that I'll have enough that I can write it, and as I'm writing, I'll use a parenthesis. I'll have like brackets and a question mark. I'll say that, you know, he turned left and drove down question mark road or lane, and then I can go back and can flesh that out later on. But yeah, I'm definitely, you know, not a plotter. Yeah, right by the seat of my pants, and hopefully I've got enough research to just carry it forward.
So one of our new admins, TK Gearing, she's also an author, she says, how do you decide on your character names?
All right. Well, I'll tell you for Leighton, but it's a secret, so don't tell anyone else this. That he's named after the cat in Alien, so the ginger cat that Sigourney Weaver leaves. That I wanted to give the character a generic name, and you know, I'm called Brown, you know, so it's the second most common name in the UK. So I wanted to give him, I didn't want to make him Smith, so I picked Jones. And also I'd found that either by chance or coincidence, that a lot of characters that I liked, quirky characters, would have that name. You know, I really like Neil Gaiman's Coraline, you know, and she's Coraline Jones, you know, and so I felt that there was already some currency there, that characters who would be called Jonesy, whether they were Indiana Jones or whether they were a cat in a spaceship or a girl investigating a magical doorway in her house, they all had that name. And the other part of it, Leighton, I chose, I just wanted the everyman sound, so he sounded like a layperson. So when I was thinking about names, I just thought, right, he's Everyman Jones, because he's not one of these Jack Reacher characters. He's not the alcohol-soaked, detective either. I wanted him to be just like everybody, someone who's struggling just to get through their job and juggle their family life and all of that. So that's where his the Leighton Jones came from, and the rest of it's usually influenced by my kind of vision of the character themselves. So when for Toys in the Dust, which was my most recently published novel, I had a small girl disappearing, and so in my head I was thinking that she's tiny and vulnerable, so she ended up being called Tina because it was just a variation of tiny in my head. And then other characters, I've got names that the kind of nemesis for Leighton in a few of the books is Gretch, his boss. So again, it was a word that sounded like it described the kind of nature of this this bucolic figure that you had to face down. And the other kind of detectives, Detective Slater, I called him, so named after a woodlouse. So yeah, a lot of the time the names are just almost phonetic, alliterative names that just kind of signify what I think of the characters. got nicer qualities, would get called Angela because it'd be angelic. so we'd work on that basis. And in Carpenter Road, got the character of Rochelle, who's the prostitute who Leighton befriends and helps. So, but again, you know, in my first version of it, I was writing her as Roxanne, you know, from the Police song, and eventually just modified it to Rochelle, just to give her that kind of name. So yeah, so the names tend to have a bit of significance, but sometimes it's just linked to my crazy image of a character in my own mind.
T also wanted to know if you edited as you go, or do you do it all at the end?
Well, I am a terrible typist. So, and also, you know, I'll have homonyms in there. When I'm writing, most of the time, like I say, because I've got that directional drive to say, right, okay, I'm going to just go with where this story's heading, that I wouldn't edit at that point. But I do feel nothing but sympathy for my actual editor to go through it at the end of the process. But yeah, I tend to get through a chapter or get through a key event, and then I go back and refine it and layer it. I suppose the closest thing I could probably compare it to would be maybe painting and blocking in, you know, big colours in big areas, and then gradually adding more and more detail until you've got something that's a little bit more refined. Not always much more, but a little bit more.
So, tell us a little bit about your day job, and then does your day job help your writing, or does your writing help your day job? Because they're kind of related.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, yeah, I've been a high school English teacher for 23 years now, and I think it would, yeah, absolutely, really closely interwoven. So, I teach all year groups from S1 to S6. So for us, it's basic transition level English skills, all the way up to writing dissertations, comparing fairly weighty texts. And along the way, we tend to be reading novels or short stories and plays in class and analysing the use of language. A lot of the time, you're talking about characterisation, structure, or development of theme. So hopefully what happens is that when I'm writing one text, that, you know, again, consciously or subconsciously, that I'm aware of you know, a 3-part structure. So the kind of things that I would tell the pupils work well, and that even for me can also inform what they're doing. And I think it's quite good, because if you're repeating the exercise yourself in your own time, you know, if I'm coming home to write stories at the same time as I'm asking my 3 or S4 pupils to go away and write stories themselves, then it adds a little bit of credibility and a little bit of empathy each way with it. So we will, in S1, our youngest year group that I teach, we study Hamlet. So it's baptism fire. So these kids come into secondary school, and suddenly they're immersed in Shakespeare's language and world. But the thing that I really love about it is this kind of intertextuality, where you can see that all of the elements are already there. You know, Hamlet's a murder mystery. You know, it's a revenge tale as well. It's got everything in it, and it's got a central tragic doomed relationship at the heart of it too. But if you're teaching things like Hamlet or Macbeth, where you have these murderous elements, and the audience is the same as the reader, who's either reading a text saying, I want this character that I care about to get out of this situation, or I want this character who's deeply in trouble to work their way out, and I want to go on that journey with them. I want to find out how they get out of that. It's fairly universal. So yeah, I would say that absolutely that side of it informs what I do, and sometimes as well, you get utterly inspired by the kind of creative process of the young people that I work with. So there'll be brainstorming ideas. And just now I've just read about 60 creative pieces that people's produced to send away to the exam board as their creative writing folio. Some of them are stunningly good, and the concepts that they come up with, even formats. One pupil, she submitted a piece that was a creative piece that was written in the form of letters between someone in America and someone in London in Victorian times. It was just really clever, really inspiring. So sometimes the young people force you to raise your game as well, just to keep up.
Yeah. There's a question here from Jason Kelly. He says, how much time do you spend deciding your book titles, and how much influence do you get on your book titles and covers?
The truth is, very little kind of guidance, or I'm published with Bloodhound Books, and Betsy Reevely gives us a long lead in terms of our book titles and covers as well. Will ask us what we're really looking for, will give us a lot of input, and will mock up covers for us and send us through a selection of covers that we'll choose from. But in terms of titles, with the exception of my first book, that one, The Girl on the Bus, where there was editorial discussion about that, because obviously at the time The Girl on the Train was enjoying such success, and there was the very realistic worry that lots of people would either say, well, this is just someone who's jumping on the bandwagon, and how many, we've got the girl on the trike, the girl on the wheelbarrow, the girl on the sledge, but where does this end? But that had been its title, and it had been its title before The Girl on the Train came out. And so I was just being a little bit stubborn and belligerent. It was actually so that it had two other titles, so as well. So it was called The Last Bus as well prior to that. And I had another one that was called The Dark Road. So it had a couple of titles, but yeah, so we had a discussion about it, and then decided, look, what the hell? I figured it was my first book anyway, and we just see what happens. So that did that operated that way. Carpenter Road was slightly different, and that took me a little while to come up. Well, I had mooted the idea that I wanted to call it Carpenter Road and get tapped into kind of the girl on kind of chain. So yeah, I decided that I probably wanted to have this simplistic title, but the reason that Carpenter Road even came around as a book was that when I was doing research for The Girl on the Bus, and I was looking at various locations where this bus that's quite a sinister vehicle could hide and be unseen. I was looking around various roads in California, dusty tracks, and a lot of them were kind of farm roads, ranch tracks. So one was a place that kind of stuck out for me was a place called Black Mountain Ranch, and the other one was Carpenter Road. Carpenter Road kind of reminded me of a sinister kind of Lewis Carroll story, and called The Walrus and the Carpenter. This kind of narrative poem, and it's got really sinister undertones. It involves some little oysters that are sitting on the beach that are encountering these two sinister figures who come along, a carpenter and a walrus, who lure them behind a rock where they kind of gleefully devour them. So when I saw the name Carpenter Road in the middle of writing a serial killer fiction novel, I noted it down, and I never ever used it within The Girl on the Bus. But when I came back and opened the file on the computer to consider a second novel, that popped up as one of the key locations. So I decided to go with it, to stick with that one, and it's the first murder location in that novel. So that's where Carpenter Road came from. And Toys in the Dust is just a more thematic title. So all the way through that book, I think I mentioned it several times. There's different symbolic references to Toys in the Dust. And so yeah, that one came around as I was writing it rather than a starting point, where the other two were there from the get-go, from the very beginning. And the last one, Sinking into Darkness, again, it's thematic because there's depression in the novel, and also there's these crimes that are taking place at night, and it's heading into winter in terms of setting. So that's where that came from. Okay, so sorry, I'm not so long-winded, but that's essentially it.
No, it's fine. There was a couple of people have asked, would you write in other genres?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would. So I have a novel that I'm not sure what I'm going to do with. It's a complete novel. It's not particularly. It's about 330 pages long. It's called The Scarecrow's Heart. That is about a woman in London whose husband leaves one morning to get the tube into the city, and she gets out of bed and goes and switches on the coffee machine and switches on the television, and she sees that there's been a terrible train crash in central London, and she drops her coffee and she gets on the helpline and she realizes this is her husband's commuter train, and the incident is so severe, a complete old building has collapsed into a tunnel and it's crushed the train, and there's been no survivors. So over the course of the next 12 hours, she is bereft, and she goes into the bedroom and takes out her husband's clothing and stuffs it and makes this substitute person to lie with as she's crying. And as darkness falls, she's lying there crying in the darkness, and she's telling this scarecrow of her husband that she misses him and that she wishes he could come back, and she's imagining his responses in the darkness, and he's saying, "I can't come back, and it's beautiful where I am," and whatnot. But 3 days into the event, she gets contacted by the police liaison service, who tell her that there's no forensic evidence of her husband on the train. And she says, "What, you mean that he was so badly destroyed?" And they said, "No, you're not listening. There's no forensic evidence of your husband on this train." So she goes back into the bedroom and confronts the scarecrow and asks, "Where the hell is he?" And she goes on a mission to find out where her husband really is. But it's it's a contemporary non-romantic story that's about the dismantlement of a relationship, and gradually, her peeling back the layers on this kind of Russian doll of her marriage. So I've written that one, and I didn't really know what to do with it because I didn't really want to cut across genres in between the first, second, and third. So it may well be that when the fourth Leighton Johns novel comes out, and that's neatly kind of contained, that I might just release The Scarecrow's Heart, and I've also got a ghost story novel on the back burner, which is about 25,000 words in just now, set in Paris. That actually every so often, usually midwinter, I go back and add a few more chapters to that. I just wanted to write a story about somebody renting a property in Paris and discovering it was haunted. It's just for fun, but so I've no aversion to writing in other genres, except I couldn't do teen fiction or anything involving werewolves and vampires or anything like
that. There's a question from Phil Jordan. He says, "What's the one thing you know now that you would have implemented during the writing of your first novel?" That's a question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a brilliant question. I think that I would have been more fearless, and I think that there's probably an awful lot of incredibly talented storytellers out there, far better than me, who would be hesitant about getting that story out there and discussing and marketing their work. I think that I was so self-conscious and so self-deprecating that yeah, I'd spent a lot of time thinking no one would like this story, or this will be too over the top. 27 serial killers on one bus, or not. And in actual fact, that I received such kind, generous, positive feedback over the first year that book was published, that it was really heartwarming, but actually made me realise that my lack of confidence was unwarranted. And I imagine, even when I do speak to high school students about the writing, that when I've said to them that this is fantastic, this is really rich storytelling, that there's almost like a default position of saying, no, it can't be any good, as if there's a tier or a level that you have to attain before you're an amazing storyteller. So yeah, I probably were to do it all again, that I would have been more proactive and more forceful in terms of kind of pushing that story and raising awareness of the story as well. But yeah, great question.
So you're obviously not afraid of going quite dark with your writing. Is there any subjects that you wouldn't write about?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think that I go quite dark in terms of the subject matter, but I'm not a particularly graphic writer. I really wouldn't. I try not to glorify or bask in the kind of torturous aspects. Although, I write about some fairly grim serial killers. I sometimes think that less is more there. It's kind of like when you watch the scary movie and the camera pans away at the last minute and you hear the sound, and your imagination makes up the rest. So yeah, I would always steer away from that really graphic stuff. And I know, look, even within our own publishing stable, a lot of the Bloodhound Hound writers, a lot of those guys write some really dark, really graphic stuff that there's a big market for, and it's highly entertaining. But yeah, that's not for me. And similarly, the funny thing is that Toys in the Dust, originally when it was first, a lot of book bloggers were doing promos on that, and because it sounds so essentially, yeah, it's a story about a kid that gets abducted by this sinister kind of predatory killer, but within the first 2 chapters, she's escaped from this person. So essentially, she's trying to evade this really dark, sinister character. And I think I've mentioned before that I wrote that one based on a historical cold case, the Maria Rudolph case, so one of America's longest cold cases involving the murder of a child. That the way that I wrote that and the way I pursued that story was to write about a way that I wished that the real story had gone. So I wished, that history had been different. So I wouldn't normally write about infanticide or anything like that. So that was more cathartic for me. So yeah, and I know because you could look at the catalogue of killings and The Girl on the Bus or Carpenter Road and go, yeah. But yeah, I approach dark subjects, but I try and approach them at a certain distance so that it's not too horrific.
So Lucy, another one of our admins, wants to know what authors have influenced you and who do you read for pleasure?
So, I mean, probably in terms of crime fiction, it would be a combination of Ian Rankin and Michael Connelly. There's 2 of them overlapping, and for me, I suppose that the first thing that Ian Rankin really brought to my attention was the idea that Rebus could be this difficult character who doesn't necessarily attract loving attention from everyone else in the police station, but can be dogged in their pursuit of the truth. and justice. Michael Connelly, Harry Bosch for another reason, and that Michael Connelly's influence on me is really when I read The Black Echo, that again, because I've never been to America, I've never been to Los Angeles and California, that it gave me that sense of a different place, like taking a holiday, except it's a holiday with a murder, a homicide being investigated in the heart of it. So I think that probably a combination of these guys fed into the creation of Leighton Jones as this character who was a square peg in a round hole, and certainly that I tried to always create the sense that Leighton wasn't particularly comfortable in his role within the police, that he wanted to do the right thing, but he really wasn't interested in promotion or the power structures or the politics or the hierarchy. So I do see shades of that whenever reviewers say that Leighton Jones reminds them of Harry Bosch and his doggedness or whatever. Then yeah, that's probably the influence there that Michael Connelly's brought across to him. But I think in the bigger sense, in the writing generally, that probably my all-time favourite book is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and I show that to kids in class. I'll hold up a copy of it, and some of these old Penguin classics have got the most ridiculously boring landscape pictures as the front cover. You're thinking that you've got this book that's got everything in it, that's got some horrific crimes in there, and they've chosen to show some hay bales in a field somewhere or a watermill. But the opening of Great Expectations with an orphan nursing his parents and siblings' gravestones in the middle of a bleak moor to be confronted by a convict who's horrific in himself, of grabbing this poor boy and threatening him, but actually for him to say that if you don't go and get me wine and littles and a file and bring them back here, that I'll set this other man on you who's hidden here with me, who has his own secret ways of creeping to a boy's house and creeping through the window and getting at them. And he says, you can hide beneath the bedclothes, you can pull him up, but he will get at you and he will take out your liver. And I mean, for me as a teacher, if I read Great Expectations to any class and got through to the point where Pip has been confronted by the situation, and I stop reading, they will say, "Oh, sir, go read on." It's fantastic narrative hook stuff, and of course, Great Expectations has got Miss Havisham and the huge Gothic mansion and secrets that go on with it. So for me, I remember reading that, and it was one of the first books that I read. We didn't have any books in the house when I was a kid, not in a tragic way. My mum thought that they created dust and they were messy, and so we had no books. And so Great Expectations was one of the first books that I'd taken from the school library and read and thought, wow, this is immense. This has hooked me in. So that's probably one of the greatest ones, and it sounds, I don't mean it in a pretentious way to say that, I like Shakespeare most and Dickens, but in actual fact, these guys were amazing storytellers. And yeah, so they're the ones that I have up there on that shelf in my head, thinking that's who I want to be like.
But when you're buying books now, who are your go-to? I call them your shut up and take my money authors, the ones that you'll just buy. You don't even read the back of the book.
I would still be like that with Stephen King. I would, The Outsider kind of blew me away. When I read that most recently, Doctor Sleep. I think that Stephen King is I know that he's incredibly successful. And you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of sales, but I think that there's still a degree of kind of snobbery in the academic world in terms of looking at him as a chronicler of his times, and the novels. I'm not just thinking of, obviously that there's the kind of classic horror novels that, of The Shining and Christine, Salem's Lot, It, that are wonderful, entertaining books. But for me, reading different seasons, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption and The Body, Stand By Me, these stories are fantastic. And the Richard Bachman books, the books that King wrote under his pseudonym, are immensely prophetic. Rage, the Long Walk. Stephen King, really there in the late 1970s, wrote about television shows where contestants would enter into them hoping to win more money than they could ever imagine, but ultimately they would be risking their lives or losing their lives as part of the competition, and that people tune in for this to watch every week and say, who's going to die in this program, and isn't it great? And we've seen this echoed not just through reality television shows, but you see it echoed in the Hunger Games. And just think that, for me, if a Stephen King book comes out, then absolutely, I would have that on my Christmas or birthday list. And there's been very few, when I think about the volume of work that he's produced, that there's very few that I didn't really connect with. Joyland, the one about the murder in the theme park, is probably, it's close to being one of my all-time favourite books. I think it does everything. It gives you that sense of escapism, and gives you an entertaining location where you can find out the secrets of the carny world of the people that work in fairgrounds. It's a coming-of-age story, ghost story. It's just sublime. So I'd always be there for King, Val McDermid for the same reason, and recently I've enjoyed Lynn Anderson, got into reading Lynn Anderson, and I think probably for me what I tend to do is I tend to enjoy shifting from some homegrown local crime fiction to then after that I'm not necessarily thinking I want to go on to just read the next book in the series or more of the same. I tend not to do that binge thing, even if I think some people are like that in life, so they might binge fiction wise and then they might binge on Netflix, and I tend to like to savour things, so I tend to mix it up a little bit. And if I see a Bill Bryson non-fiction book come out, the last one I read was The Body and the Workings of the Human Body, but it's kind of witty and entertaining, that I would go for that and break up my reading, and then I would choose something local or something different. But I must say that my job does entail me reading probably, so the kids write 1,300 words for their folio, and there's 2 pieces in it. So every pupil in my senior school writes 2,000 words for English, and so I'm reading about 180,000 words worth of fiction as part of my job, even before I get home. So sometimes I think it probably depends on what I'm reading work-wise, what I choose to order from Amazon or Waterstones when I get back home.
So I'm going to ask you one of our group's favourite questions now. What are your most memorable moments as an author?
Oh, right, wow. Right, there'll be a few. I'll tell you that the first one is always that that notice of representation. So when you get that letter or that email back, the first one is when you put your synopsis and maybe your sample chapters, maybe the first 3 chapters, and you put them out there like, it's like putting messages into bottles and throwing them into the ocean. And there's a lot of publishing houses and agents won't get back to you at all. You'll hear nothing. And then there's a few that will get back with a stock rejection. and then there's some kind, generous souls that will get back and say to you what they liked and what they didn't like, or what they felt was a stumbling block in terms of offering representation. And then, then you get that Willy Wonka golden ticket when you get that notification. So, for me, that standout moment would be when you've got a request for the full manuscript of one of your pieces of work, and you've sent that off, and you get the ping, the notification, and you open it, and it says, we're delighted to offer you representation on this. And so there's that moment. That part of that euphoria that you have at that point will be exchanging contracts, getting your contract sent out, and signing your first contract as an author. So that would be right up there. And then there's that Christmas morning when, for us with Bloodhound, we would normally be sent a mug. In fact, what's here? No, I think it's, I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but you get.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right. So you'd get you get a copy of your book and a mug sent through. So the first time that you look down and see that book that you've been putting together over months physically there in front of you, that would be up there as well. And I must say, out of all of them, for me, the best and most memorable thing is the first kind of heartwarming review. So the first time that you hear that somebody read and connected with that book, that they really loved that, you can't beat that, and that's the reason for doing it,
Do your family read your books?
So my eldest son, he's 21, so he's read all of them, and my wife has started reading 2 of them, and the first book she refused to read because she said, quite fairly, she said, you have spoken about this so bloody much that I feel like I have lived through this book. So there could be no plot surprises for her. I've got 3 sisters, and one of my sisters who is not a reader, actually, in the last year, she read all 3 of the Leighton Jones books. She really liked them, and it kicked in a little reading habit for her. So ever since that, she's told me that she's going to read another book, and so it's kind of kick-started something good for her. But I would say that my family of adults, they've read them, but and it's great, and it's nice to have people that are supportive out there. But there's always that doubt if your friends and family read your book and then they tell you that they really liked your book, you're still thinking, did you really like my book, or are you telling me as a friend or as a brother that you really liked my book? It's kind of when you get those anonymous people on the other side of the world that said, I really loved this, it was fantastic. I had one the other day that a man called Seth, who had just read the box set of the 3 books on Amazon. And because it's a box set, there's a lot of people who wouldn't download the kind of digital box set because maybe they'd already downloaded the first or second book, and so they felt that were paying for something that they already had. So you don't get as many pings, you don't get as many hits with your box set as you do with your individual books. So it kind of sat there for like 6 months and not doing much. But there was but this guy had read the 3 of the books in the box set and left just a really nice, just genuine review. And it made my day, in fact, it made my week to just to read this from a stranger, So so as nice as family and friends are reading my stuff, that I much prefer strangers. Just don't tell them that.
How do you find handling the social media side of being an author? Because I know like teachers have to be very cautious about their online presence.
Yeah, it's there's a couple of things. The first thing is it's tricky to juggle. You know, it's tricky to be present because your working week fluctuates, and sometimes you know the marking workload, or sometimes even the pastoral care of students takes priority. So there are times when I'll feel like you know that I should be on Twitter or I should be on Facebook more. Because it's such a kind of active cauldron of discussion. Um, I haven't found any problems in terms of work and content. I kind of thought that I would. I was expecting it would be a backlash at some point, that during a kind of parents' evening, that some parent would, in the middle of a discussion about their son or daughter's punctuation, would say, by the way, you're right about some terrible things, but it's usually been the opposite. You know, it's usually that last year I had two parents in school that at different parents' evenings had asked me if I could sign a copy of Carpenter Road and The Girl on the Bus during a kind of parents' contact evening, which was really nice. But the pupils aren't as phased as maybe they would have been a few years back, because you know they live in a very vastly more entertaining kind of TikTok based world than the kind of pedestrian Facebook and Twitter activities that I would have. So I'm not sure that they would even slow themselves down to have a look at it. I think if I was a YouTuber, if I had an author's YouTuber page, that the pupils might troll me online. But no, they've been fine, and I think actually that the social media side of it, in some ways, it places greater demands on authors to to delve into these spaces and inhabit these spaces as well, and it's unknown territories for many authors. So we're kind of creeping away from our laptops and typewriters and whatnot to kind of explore this. But that's a good thing. You know, it's a good thing. I think it's a really healthy thing to be able to see readers discussing what they like and what they don't like in texts. I think that that we could exist in splendid isolation, just trying to write a book that's quite self-serving, and just a writer entertaining themselves through writing the books. But if you're serious about trying to write something that's going to engage readers, then the most important thing is to listen to readers when they say what engages them. So the social media side of it, yeah, absolutely, it is a challenge, but it's just a challenge to stay in the space, to dip in as often as possible and find out what's happening in there.
Fair enough. What have you got planned next? What's the next books that are coming out for you?
Right, so I've got Beneath a Tangled Tree, which is the first book in a trilogy. So I wrote a synopsis for 3 books, all of them involving the same character, who's a sociology lecturer at Stirling University, who gets pulled into to 3 cases. And so the first one, Beneath a Tangled Tree, is essentially involves this lecturer who is told by a colleague that that the colleague is going to be looking into a historical disappearance of a teenage girl who vanished in 1987 from an area of woodland. And she tells my central character, Claire Graver, that she thinks that she would be particularly interested in this. And when Claire asks her why, she tells her that her husband, Claire's husband, had been the boyfriend of the girl who disappeared back in 1987. So the lecturer immediately assumes that there's been some kind of mistake and says that's impossible, until she heads home and mentions this to her husband across the dinner table, at which point he has a tantrum and stands up and says that he doesn't want to speak about this before leaving and slamming the door, which takes this character down the rabbit hole. So really she's digging into the past to find out what happened to this girl who vanished. And these Claire Draver books are all based around significant locations for different reasons. So this one, the first book, which I'm just about finished, I'm actually doing the edits on that just now, involves the girl disappearing from a place called Doon Hill in Aberfoyle up here in Scotland, where there's a very famous tree called the Fairy Tree. And this is a kind of spiritual, sacred place historically. And legends of the fairy kind and the wee people. So for a long time, for hundreds of years, local people have gone there and left messages tied to the tree branches. And yes, incredibly evocative, atmospheric place where this disappearance occurred. So yeah, so they're going to keep me pretty busy. So as I say, I finished the first one, and it involves locations that I know incredibly well, and anyone who's been up to bloody Scotland will know pretty well too. So yes, I've got the three of them to crack on with, and as I say, the Parisian ghost story will probably pull me in December between the Claire Draver novels, and I'll see how they go. The difficulty that I had writing about Leighton Jones, the California novels, was that I was aging the character backwards. So once I've taken him from the end of his career and taken him back through these 4 novels, I actually get to the start of his career. So there's nowhere left to go. If I was writing about Leighton Jones, the early years, it would be him in high school, and Leighton Jones in kindergarten. So there's a natural stopping point there. Whereas with the Claire Draver novels, that the first 3 novels just span 2 years in her life as an academic come murder investigator. So I'll see that it's 3 just now. It could end up being 6 or 9. It really depends if it can sustain my interest and readers' interest too. But yeah, they should be fun, and that should keep me going certainly till this time next year, I would hope.
Excellent. We've only got a few minutes left, so do you want to just remind us of your current book titles?
Certainly, yeah. So the first novel, they're all standalone novels, so there's no reason why you would have to read any of them. But in terms of the publishing order, the first novel is The Girl on the Bus, and the second novel is called Carpenter Road, and then the most recent one is Toys in the Dust. And each of them are based upon characters who have disappeared or who vanished, and usually a friend of the person who's disappeared has enlisted the help of Leighton Jones to find out what's going on. And all 3 of them involve fairly sinister serial murders as well. So it's heartwarming stuff for the evening by the fire.
Can people buy signed copies from yourself?
Yeah, they can. So they can contact me via the website and they can buy signed copies of the book. My links to my website on my Facebook page, my Facebook author page, and on my Twitter page, which is @NonTheWriter.
Why did you choose to have initials on your book covers?
Originally, so at the time when I was first putting it together, there already was a Norman Brown out there and a Norm Brown who was writing, and my middle name is Martin. So the Norman Martin side of it would have been so large that it would have reduced so publishers use standard kind of font sizes for titles and for author names. There's kind of recommended guidance that comes out on which ones are conspicuous and readable, especially if it's on a spine. If you've got too many letters at too small a font on the spine. It's difficult for readers to read when they're stacked in bookshops. So it was just a practical logistic reason. But I quite like the idea that that it's not gender based in that sense. So someone's looking at a book that's just got a few initials there, that there's no expectation either way. So I was quite happy just to go with that.
Great. Well, and then all that's left for us to say is thanks for coming on and spending an hour in our company.
You're very welcome, Caroline. Thoroughly enjoyed it.